on this episode of MéTV.
That sold me right there on the Indigenous programs of the Canadian military and what I was doing.
How will I reconcile myself, the Icelander and the Métis, the settler and the Indigenous?
You see the camber on it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, that's all done by heat.
I love doing art, but I don't know what I can do anymore because I'm a quadriplegic.
Tanse, and welcome to the new offices of MNBC next to the Gateway Station in Surrey. After watching MéTV, many of you have emailed us and reached out to us on social media, letting us know how much you enjoyed the show. Merci. Your comments decide the structure of the show, and keeping that in mind, let's kick off with News of the Nation. On June 17th, BC Education Minister Jennifer Whiteside announced back-to-school plans for the K-12 sector in September. The announcement allocated $5 million to Indigenous students, but only 0.8% of this for Métis children. That is just about $1,000 per MNBC chartered community. MNBC's Minister of Education, Deborah Fisher, was clearly disappointed by the announcement, saying that, quote, "This level of disregard for Métis students is disheartening and should be acknowledged," unquote. Métis youth have lower education outcomes and graduation rates than non-Indigenous students. Minister Fisher and the rest of MNBC are hopeful that Premier Horgan and Minister Whiteside will reconsider their decision on funding distribution. MNBC is marking another milestone by releasing BC's and possibly Canada's first guidebook to Métis cultural wellness. Kawichi-Haitoyak, We Take Care of Ourselves, teaches cultural wellness through exploring the rich history and unique identity of Métis people in BC. The book was developed through engagement with Métis elders and youth across the province in 2019. Thanks in part to generous contributions from the Provincial Health Services Authority and BC's Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions. Copies of Kawichi-Haitoyak can be now purchased through MNBC's online store. MNBC's Board of Directors met for the first time in half a year in Victoria last month. The board retreat gave them a chance to meet and discuss major topics impacting the BC Métis community on June 24th and 25th. Some of the topics discussed during the two-day event were self-governance, the children and family strategy, revenue diversification, and intergovernmental relations with federal, provincial, municipal, and First Nation governments. Thanks to our board for all their hard work during this event. Let's move on to the rest of the show. We recently visited Vancouver Island to meet various Métis Nation members, one of who was Métis veteran Steve Morrison of the Canadian Armed Forces out of Esquimalt. He has worked as a recruiter, focusing on Indigenous recruitment, and has been instrumental in getting the Canadian military to be more inclusive of Indigenous beliefs and customs, including updating the dress manual to allow traditional hairstyles and having smudging kits as standard inventory on all naval ships. Let's meet Steve.
We're here in Esquimalt at the CFB Esquimalt base to meet Petty Officer First Class Steve Morrison to talk to him about how he's incorporated his Métis heritage into his career with the Canadian Navy.
We always knew there was Aboriginal blood. We didn't know it was Métis. After my grandmother passed, it was actually, people talked about it more. When we found out we were Métis and started learning the history of my great-great-grandfather and grandmother, It was very interesting. I just felt I wanted to learn the knowledge. But where it really solidified is back in 2012, the Navy in its wisdom sent me to Calgary as the recruiter. The first day I walked in, they said, "Hey, you're the new recruiter. By the way, you're in charge of the Aboriginal and diversity file. Good luck on ya." And I laughed and I said, "Well, I'm Métis, maybe I'll learn something." And truer words never spoken. That's my great-great-grandfather.
Oh, wow.
My first stop in as a recruiter, we walked in and this young lady working behind the counter, her head popped up, grin ear to ear, "Bold Eagle!" And she comes running around the counter and gives us hugs. And she told us a story that her brother, who had gotten in with the gangs on the Blood Reserve, had been stopped by one of the local Mounties and the Blood Police. And they realized he hadn't gone too far, and they basically gave him a choice. Join Bold Eagle, or we're gonna follow this up and we'll go from there. Well, the young lad joined Bold Eagle, and it turned his life around. She told us he had just graduated from the academy and was a police officer down in Montana. That sold me right there on the Indigenous programs of the Canadian military and what I was doing. And it started my journey to where I am now. Smudging is traditional in many cultures. It's a prayer, it's grounding, it's a cleansing ceremony. My real job, my day job as they call it, is I'm a naval combat information operator. The best way to describe that, if you've ever seen a modern Navy movie, you go into the giant red room, the operations room, and they're watching the radars and they're firing the missiles and all that. I work in there. And one of my jobs, my last job on the ship, one of my favorite ones was, I was what they call the ops room supervisor, and we're basically the conductor. We work for the captain and the operations room officer, the guy who runs the whole thing. And we're the guy who makes sure they get the information, everyone's doing their job, and watching and doing what they need to be doing. Have you guys been smudged? Have you ever been smudged? Never. You've never been? Okay, cameras off, please. As Métis, we have a foot in each culture. We're a bridge. And it's our job to act as that bridge between the cultures. And I use that in every day that I'm doing my job with the Aboriginal Advisory Group. I am Petty Officer Steve Morrison of the Royal Canadian Navy, and I'm proud to be Métis.
We're taking a short break. When we come back, Lisa Shepard introduces our next Kete Ayak, Jónína Kirton.
Maybe one day I will just float away, see where the water takes me, but not today. Today I will rebuild. This time no quick fixes, no steel cables or wooden planks.
Welcome back. Kete Ayak, our elders, are crucial to keeping Métis spiritual traditions alive. Lisa Shepard walks with poet and BIPOC auntie Jónína Kirton to learn how creative writing can be therapy.
Jónína, I would love to spend some time talking to you today about the work that you do and just your lived experiences. Would you be willing to do that?
Absolutely. Thank you, Lisa. Marcia.
Did you always know that you're Métis?
No, I did not. I knew that we were part Native, as we said in those days. And I only knew that because of how we looked. No one in my family wanted to admit to that. My mother would occasionally say that my father was part Native, but he didn't like that, so he didn't want us to talk about it.
Right.
So I did not know for sure until I was 40. I'm 66 now.
So, do you always feel like you belong?
No.
That you're enough?
No. Actually, that's been a big part of my journey. I feel enough now, and that's been a really long journey to get here. There was a long period of time where I felt like I wasn't sure where I belonged. Was I Indigenous enough? Because I'm also in the literary world, and there's a whole Indigenous literary world, which includes more than the Métis, of course.
Right.
And so in that world, I wondered at times, was I enough even as a Métis? But also as a Métis who didn't know their language, who wasn't raised with their culture. I did wonder at times if I belonged. And then I did my research, and the more I did my research, the more I understood that I did belong. Reconciliation. How will I reconcile myself, the Icelander and the Métis, the settler and the Indigenous, an ally to myself since birth flung across a chasm? I often wonder, am I to forever be the way across? Weak anchors at each end, my spine a flexible deck, load-bearing, and within my cables too much tension. As some try to cross, we all swing wildly in each other's steps. With no safety nets, the waves of emotion threaten us all. And then there are the times that both sides seek to disown, to cut my cords. Let me fall to the rushing waters below.
You're also Icelandic?
I'm also Icelandic.
So there's that experience
my
that you bring
name,
to it, right?
yeah.
We're multi-layered.
Jónína, my name is my grandmother's name, Icelandic. So I've got those parts of me, but I don't know any of those worlds very well. And the fact of the matter is, that is perhaps because of the language. So my Icelandic grandmother spoke her language, and my grandfather made fun of her, and so she stopped speaking, I understand. And same with my Métis grandmother. So these languages being lost, I do wonder what I've lost from that. Yet, at this age, it's unlikely that I'm going to learn either language with my mind. So I'm not sure that I would be able to learn the language unless I was immersed.
But what do you have to give, though, at this age? Because I feel like that's your strength, that's your superpower.
Yes. Well, I've had to figure out who I am, like in all of this, with all of these different nationalities and all these different sort of streams in my blood. I've had to figure out, well, what does that make me? So I can't look to another person. So basically I had to understand that I'm going to look to my ancestors. So I pray to my ancestors all the time. And I see evidence continually that they hear me and they bring me what I need. So I have been able to sort of circumvent the language in that way. Maybe one day I will just float away, see where the water takes me, but not today. Today I will rebuild. This time no quick fixes, no steel cables or wooden planks. No rust, no rot, no nails necessary, but rather the slow growth of twisted roots from ancient trees. The way across a path made of grandfather and grandmother's stones. I will become a self-sustaining structure, gain strength over time, a living root bridge that lasts 500 years.
I love the poem and talking about being a bridge. Tell me, what is it to be a self-sustaining structure?
When I wrote the poem, I didn't really understand the impact of it myself, and that often happens when you write poetry. You'll later read it and you'll see that there's messages in there for yourself. And so that was incredible. And so the self-sustaining, like I have had to be self-sustaining my entire life. My relationship with my father was very challenging. He was a very damaged, hurt Métis man. And so I just branched out on my own at a very young age. 18, I left home and have been taking care of myself pretty much ever since. I didn't want to be beholden to anybody. So when I heard that Otimpeksak, do you know how to say that word? Otimpeksak?
Yeah.
The people who own themselves.
Yes.
When I heard that word, I went, oh, that's always been in me, this desire to own myself. So I did have the typical jobs that people get, a bank and the airline, but I always was sort of having these subversive acts of resistance.
Yes.
So I had to do the jobs, and so I did them. I needed to take care of myself financially, but I wouldn't fully buy in.
So I know that you work at SFU, and your title there is BIPOC Auntie.
Well, it's a fairly new position, and they actually had wanted to call me an Indigenous advisor, but I really am aware that we need to all work together, all people of color, so the Black, Indigenous, and all other people of color. So I realized that we're stronger together. And so I asked to change my name to BIPOC Auntie, and I chose Auntie because of its meaning in our culture.
The
Aunties-
kinship ties. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's very true for the Black community as well, and also for many of the other people of color. Auntie has a special meaning for them, so when they find out there's a BIPOC Auntie, they feel welcomed, they feel seen, and so that's the first step. The other thing that I do is I support them in their writing. So when they want to have one-on-one meetings with me and have me critique their writing, I can help them with their writing in a way that acknowledges that what they're writing comes from their culture. And so I'm there to support them in doing that. And there also as a backup for the mentors who are mentoring the writers if they have a question about anything to do with BIPOC writing.
I have something to thank you for spending time with me. You know, you're teaching me even in sharing this. You know, you're sharing some of your stories with me and teaching me, and I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much.
Open.
Open?
Open.
And what's in here? A box. Lisa Shepherd, Métis artist. No.
Yes.
Oh my goodness, strawberries? Look at these. Oh my goodness.
I was happy to see you wearing the long dangly earrings.
Oh my goodness.
And so strawberry, of course, is woman's berry, heartberry, the seeds on the outside.
I'm gonna cry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It is great to see Jónína integrating her Métis identity with her outreach to other poets. We could all do with more poetry in our lives in these uncertain times. We're taking a short break, and when we come back, Peter Lang from the Chilliwack Métis Association and I will talk about Métis children in government care. But first, here is the Michif word for child. Welcome back. The well-being of Indigenous youth in British Columbia is an important topic to everyone. And joining me today to discuss that in his own personal experiences of government inaction is Peter Lang. Welcome to the show, Peter.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you're very active in Chilliwack, so tell us a little bit more about your involvement with Métis Nation, both locally and throughout the province.
So I got involved when I was in university in Nanaimo at Vancouver Island University, and I started attending Mid-Island Métis Nation meetings with Tim Lowe as the president. I filled in a couple times as secretary, just on an interim basis, and then I got into corrections, and that career took me over to the mainland, and we moved to Hope, and I got a little bit detached from being connected with Métis Nation while I was working and building my career and raising my family. But once my kids started to become teenagers, I wanted to get connected again, so I linked up with Chilliwack Métis Association, and now I'm the interim president because Louis had to move on to become our regional rep. So
that's fantastic. Now, you mentioned your involvement with corrections, and I'm going to touch on that in a moment, but you're assistant warden, right? You're not just involved in corrections, you have a fairly senior position within the correction system.
Yeah, I oversee parole, probation, or it's like probation, institutional parole officers, programs, psychology, chaplaincy, elders, things like that. So
So, Peter, some people might recognize your name for having seen it in the Vancouver Sun in a full-page ad that Métis Nation British Columbia took out. There was a quote from you, and I'll read the quote, and I wouldn't mind you just providing me a little bit of context around that quote and your own kind of personal experience with children in care. But in the Vancouver Sun article, you said, quote, Métis children in care is the new residential schools. Can you expand a little bit about what that means to you and why you made that statement?
Yeah, I've actually said it several times. I've said it on social media as well as verbally, but often what I say is it's the pipeline to the prison system, the child welfare system. Much like residential schools harmed our children, child welfare is harming our children today, and it's that disconnect of our children from their culture that the child welfare system sort of perpetuates, that basically causes trauma in our children, and that's what leads to them ending up in prison later on.
So, Peter, you have a very personal experience. Your son passed away. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about what happened?
Yeah, my son, Nick, passed away in June of 2015. And he was in the child welfare system, specifically the youth justice system. He was on probation. He developed an addiction in January of 2015. And we went looking for help for his addiction. It was to methamphetamine. And there was no help around at the time. There was literally nothing. His addiction got worse to the point where he assaulted his mother, and his mother called 911, and that started this chain of events rolling where he ended up in conflict with the law. And when he was under charge, I talked to the probation officer, and basically what he said was the only way to get help for a youth in British Columbia at the time was to plead guilty to the crime and go into the youth justice program and then get a condition to have to attend programming, substance abuse programming. So that's what Nick did. He wanted help, and he pled guilty, and he went off to a program. Information wasn't shared between the Ministry of Children and Families and the people running the program, and he ended up taking his own life in a closet about 9 days after he got there, or 6 days after he got there.
That's so tragic, and we've our community has shared our grief with you, and when something like this happens, obviously as a parent, you've lost your child, and you've been very active to try to make change and have government change policy. What's changed since your son's passed away in your advocacy on this file? Has anything gotten better?
Yeah, it's gotten better. It took a long time. Like, nobody would listen to us at first. I never went public with Nick's story when he first passed away. I was waiting for the government to reach out to us and say, hey, what can we do to make sure this doesn't happen again? And they never did. They threw walls up. So we felt we had no choice but to sue in order to get them to listen. So we started a lawsuit. Then the government changed, and the John Horgan government was elected. And once they were elected, all the doors started to open. They started to reach out to us, even though we were still suing, technically them. But the doors opened. Minister Katrina Conroy actually invited us to meet and to talk. And we started to see change start to happen. So,
what kind of change, Peter? When you say you've seen change, or what specifically is happening in the system that gives you hope?
Well, there's actual help for youth now. Like, we have a youth treatment center in Chilliwack, right beside the Travel Lodge, for example, that just opened. We have the Chilliwack Youth Health Center, which I'm actually involved with as a volunteer as well, where youth can go and get culturally appropriate services at Chilliwack Senior Secondary. And those types of things are starting to show up in other communities. The John Howard Society, for example, has the program called The Foundry that they run in various different places that have these types of resources for you. None of that stuff was there before, but now we're starting to see it show up. We still need more.
That's what I was going to ask you. What more could or should be done in the coming months and years to be able to make sure that there are no kids that do tragically die the way your son did?
Well, we need Métis Nation to have responsibility over our own children, for sure. I see what's going on in Kamloops with Lee Michiff, and I'd love to see that in every region of BC, run by Métis Nation as a delegated agency, where we take charge of our own children. So when another parent calls up the Minister of Health because their child's addicted, they can say, you know what, we've got this program. When I called the Minister of Health back in 2015, she wanted to help, Tanya DeVore, and wanted to help. And but there wasn't any help available, even through Métis Nation. So that's what I envision for the future, is that we have control over our own children, and we can give them the culturally appropriate interventions that they need.
So when you put that quote in the ad, do you feel like that made a difference? How did it? Do you think it's going to make an impact in terms of the current provincial government and so many kids that are still in care that need help?
I hope it does. I mean, I'd like to see things move faster. For sure, we have a Métis Nation justice strategy, for example, that I helped develop that's still not signed off yet. And I raised that with Minister Eby when I talked to him about another issue. And I'd like to see that signed. It's things like that help move our nation forward and help strengthen our kids, make them more resilient.
Peter, thank you so much for sharing your story, for providing the quote, and for, I think, positively impacting the lives of so many kids that you may never ever meet in your life. Your advocacy is so valuable. When we come back, we're going to learn a little bit more about violin bows and how that relates to playing fiddle music.
Oh, I probably make anywhere between 6 to 12 bows a year. I do a lot of rehairs, I do restorations, repairs. I like it because there's always challenges to it. You have to do a lot of thinking before you walk into the workshop.
Welcome back. The fiddle is a representation of the Métis soul, and there can be no fiddle music without the bow. We recently visited John Bell in Campbell River on Vancouver Island to see the process of making it.
When I joined the association here, the local association, part of the Métis culture is fiddling. So they decided they would have group fiddling lessons. So they hired this really good teacher. He's not Métis, but he would come up to our office. And there was probably about a dozen of us. So we threw $100 in each, and we got these really cheap violins. So away we went. Well, I stuck at it for a while because I wanted to learn to play. But you know, you reach a plateau, and if you don't have it, you're not going to play. And I didn't have it. But I like woodworking. I remember one day I was practicing away and I thought, what it was like building a violin. So I went online and looked for courses on how to build it or some type of information, and I couldn't find anything. But I did find a course about how to build violin bows. So I applied through the employment and training, and they approved it. So I went down there for 5 weeks, and I learned a completely new skill, which now I qualify as a luthier. So say I'm going to make a bow out of this. What you have to do is get good designs. So what we do is just put it down, and we'll just copy the head, you know, just draw around it. And then once I do that, it comes out looking like this.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it looks like this. Now you see the angle on that? That angle is about 8.5 to 9 degrees.
Okay.
And then it narrows here. So all the rest of it is pretty well square. And then I'm going to make the whole thing octagonal. Then I heat it. I get a camber on it. You see the camber on it?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's all done by heat. I retired in Ontario. I was in Sault Ste. Marie, and I moved out here because of family and friends. And my wife is from Burnaby. A couple of years after we're here, another family member in Alberta tells the family members here, "Hey, you know you're Métis?" We have, "No, what's Métis?" So anyway, she sent us all the documentation, and sure enough, we met all the criteria. So I thought, well, I'll find out about it, because if you want to enjoy an organization or whatever, you should get involved, eh? So I got involved, and it was really great. I've never regretted it. Once I've got the nice camber on it, and I use this thing, is I take this and
bend it to
that.
Oh, wow.
That's my gauge. So then I get set with this. I have this one here is octagonal, and it stays octagonal, and this has to be a certain size. And then I have to cut this square hole in it,
Sure, yeah.
and I use one of those machines over there, and I have to put a hole in the end. So what happens is the frog would go on like this, and this would go inside. And this little eyelet, see this eyelet? It screws in like that.
Oh, okay.
This is what they call a modern bow. So it goes in there, the eyelet's screwed on, and the eyelet goes up through that hole there. I do all kinds of work on all kinds of different bows. It's been not only a good hobby, but it's actually a business as well. So I've made money and I've been able to buy tools and all sorts of things. So yeah, it was really good. And that was through the employment training. If I didn't have that, then perhaps I wouldn't have taken it. So it does the cut.
Gotcha.
Okay, and you always keep a little bit back before you start it.
Okay.
Okay. No, that was just a touch too slow, but other than that, you're a natural.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, I probably make anywhere between 6 and 12 bows a year. I do a lot of rehairs, I do restorations, repairs. I like it because there's always challenges to it. It's not just sitting there, you know, carving on a piece of wood. There's, you know, different types of wood, different types of way to fix it. You're always coming up with problems that you've got to solve. You have to do a lot of thinking before you walk into the workshop. When I'm making a Métis bow, here's the difference. This here is buffalo horn, bison. It's pretty old, and I got a whole pile of them, and they finish up beautiful. I'll show you one that's finished. Here's a completed one.
Oh, that's stunning.
Yeah. Now, this is buffalo, and that's moose.
Oh, wow.
So what I do is I take moose horn, antlers or whatever, and I put them on the tip. Now this is just the start of a tip. And what's going to happen is the tip, kind of my signature, trademark, it'll be a tip like this.
That's beautiful.
Who knew building a violin bow can be such a complicated and yet rewarding process? Incidentally, John got his training through MNBC's employment training program a few years back, and I'm glad that the program's education is being put to good use. When we come back, after a short break, I'll chat with Emerald Unruh. She's an SFU student and Terry Fox Humanitarian Scholar of Indigenous Studies. Meanwhile, here is the Michif word for student. Welcome back. The issue of Métis identity is being researched in universities across the country. Joining me today is Emerald Unruh. She is a political science student. In fact, she's going to become a political scientist, we hope, one day. And she's going to be talking to us a little bit about the whole issue of Métis identity. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm really excited to be studying political science and Indigenous studies at Simon Fraser University. I'm about to graduate and I really hope to go on to do that kind of advocacy work moving forward. And Métis identity has always been really important to me. You know, growing up, my grandma, who we called Mums, was incredibly, incredibly proud of who we were. And she would often break out photos of my great uncle in his beaded jacket and tell us stories about what it was like to grow up Métis, and really worked hard to instill that pride in us from a young age. And it's been a really beautiful journey about learning who we are and where we come from ever since.
So many Métis people don't know that they're Métis until later in life. You were very fortunate, I guess you knew at a younger age.
Yeah, I think it's been a really beautiful journey, and it's a really wonderful gift that she made sure she gave all of her grandchildren. And it's important to recognize that a lot of our Métis kin are just figuring out who they are and where they come from as they move forward. And for me, that has also been like a rediscovering process. Growing up, there was no real distinction made about this is a specific Métis teaching or this is a specific way that we do things. But the older I get, the more I see that the things that we did growing up was a Métis way of life. They were Métis values and practices, and just so lucky. What's your journey been like?
Well, I was just going to say, because that was very similar for me, because I did not know that I was Métis until relatively recently, and yet The more I've done my research and explored, I look back on my childhood, and it's actually completely changed the way I look at how I grew up, because we played the spoons and we had the fiddle and we played the Red River Jig and we did all that, but yet it was never labeled and never spoken about as being Métis. So when I hear you talk about that, it's really interesting that so many of us have had that experience where we were living our culture, but it didn't actually didn't have that brand. Now, you did a TED Talk. So for those our viewers who aren't familiar with TED Talks, that must have been exciting for you. Tell us a little bit about what is a TED Talk.
It was really exciting, and it was actually quite a nerve-wracking process, but I was really lucky. The folks at TEDx SFU were really supportive and helped me put together a wonderful talk, and really just explored the past 5 generations of Métis women in my family and what that experience has been like. And it's exactly like you say, there are so many of us who don't realize that we're Métis, and as we learn more and more about our culture, go, oh wow, this really is who I am. And we see ourselves reflected in those stories that we tell to one another. And so the TED Talk experience was really wonderful because it gave me an opportunity to share that really broadly.
So what do you think are some of the big challenges for Métis youth, or just Métis people in British Columbia in general?
Yeah, I think it's, honestly, I think it's having the courage to go and connect with your Métis community, to make that first connection and take that first step. Most youth, once they do that, experience really great connection and kind of that feeling of going home, which I think is so important.
Thank you so much, Emerald, for being on the show today. Really appreciate that. And when we come back, we're going to feature Métis artist Jónína Magnuson.
This painting was one that didn't know what I wanted to paint. So the lady said, well, why don't you try a flower? Because if you oops that, then it's okay. Nobody's going to know but yourself. So I thought, okay, I'll try a flower.
Welcome back. As we wrap this episode, I want to share with you a story of resilience. Jónína Magnuson. After she broke her neck and was paralyzed from the neck down, Jónína began mouth painting as a creative outlet to help her cope. She now lives in a group home in Campbell River, where she paints every day and sells her paintings online.
I always liked doing art. I never really painted much, but I always liked the color. I went into art studio that I have at GF Strong. She says, how are you? Good, I can't remember the lady's name. And I just wanted to go and look around. And she goes, are you interested in art at all? And I said, yeah. I said, I am. I said, I love doing art, but I don't know what I can do anymore because I'm a quadriplegic. And she goes, well, come with me, I want to show you something. And she says, see that painting over there, this fox? And I said, yeah, it looks so real. She goes, well, that was a mouth painting. She goes, would you be interested in trying something like that? I said, okay. So she set me up with an easel, and the first thing I painted was a cherry blossom.
Did you always know that you were Métis?
No, I didn't really know till I was about, I guess, 16, 17. Like, I like to know about every one of my nationalities because I think it's important. Not only that, it teaches people how to be kind and considerate to one another. The more we educate them, and not to make people so close-minded in the world. I think that's important. This painting was one that didn't know what I wanted to paint. So the lady said, well, why don't you try a flower? Because if you oops that, then it's okay. Nobody's gonna know but yourself. So I thought, okay, I'll try a flower. March 8th in 2018, when I had my accident. I got up at about 3 o'clock in the morning. When I stood up, and I stood up slowly, and all of a sudden, it's like everything twisted, and it was, I can't even explain it. Rumbled up in a ball almost. And I woke up on the floor. I couldn't really move at all. I couldn't move my arms, couldn't move my feet, hands, nothing. I guess it was several weeks later, in and out of consciousness, that I woke up when I was in the hospital bed. And I was scared, and Chris said, "You're okay, you got a trach in you, so that's why you can't talk. And you broke your neck." And I was crying one time when I was in the hospital. I said, "What good am I now? I'm a bump." And I still feel that way sometimes. But because of it, and because of me speaking out what happened to me, it helps educate people and teach them not to be scared to ask about me. I pray to my Creator to help give me strength and to let me get over the moment that I'm having, because I don't call it a bad day. I have bad moments, not bad days. Well, eventually I would like to open up my own studio and teach other people how to mouth paint, regardless if they can use their hands or not, and come and listen and ask me questions. This is a picture that I did that I'd like to give to you.
Oh, thank you so much.
It took me about 3.5 days to paint.
It's beautiful. Is there a story behind it?
Well, Northern Lights to me always represents this spirit.
That's beautiful.
So,
thank you so much.
yeah.
Thank you. That's a beautiful gift. Got you signed and everything on there.
Yeah. And yes, I do it myself.
What an inspiration Shauna is. There are countless stories such as hers to be told in our Métis nation of BC. And you can be sure that we will try and tell as many of them as we can. If you have comments or suggestions, please reach out to us. Hope to see you again in our next episode. Until then, Mina Kuapamitin.